Hello everyone, welcome back to Spectator Sports, where we cover sports from a spectator's point of view. This is episode number 125. I'm your host, Sebastian Fonseca. The NFL playoffs are here and the regular season is wrapped up, but we also have some major headlines in the NBA to cover in this episode. But before we get into the content, please do us a massive favor. Please drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps this video perform in the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to get clips from today's episode, we got that for you here on YouTube in our various playlists. Additionally, we have it on TikTok. And if you want to enjoy Spectator Sports from an audio perspective, we got that for you too. I'll link the Spotify, the TikTok, and the YouTube channel. Everything in the description. Let's get into today's episode. The Baltimore Ravens clinched the AFC North, and with this win, they will host the slumping Pittsburgh Steelers next week on Wildcard Weekend. This matchup coming up next Saturday will be the rubber match as the two teams split the season series 1-1. It's been a tale of different teams since the first matchup to the second matchup. In the first matchup in Pittsburgh, the Ravens were still finding themselves. They were up and down, and most of the time, and especially against the Pittsburgh Steelers, they struggled. And Mike Tomlin with Russell Wilson on a hot streak, they were unbeaten in that many starts in that first matchup. But since in the second matchup, the Steelers have tailed off and they got into this slump. And in fact, they closed out the season on a 4-game losing streak to end the regular season. With an opportunity to improve their seeding upon their matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, the Steelers' offense looked totally anemic. George Pickens, their star standout receiver, struggled. He had 3 drops on Saturday night, including and 1 catch for 0 yards. Outside of Pat Freiermuth, I am not scared of a single pass catcher or weapon for the Steelers offense. Najee Harris was stuffed in the backfield countless times against a okay Cincinnati defense, but Russell Wilson, the decision making late, especially against the Bengals, where he advanced the ball, rushing the ball instead of throwing it out of bounds when he could have had a chance to get Chris Boswell into field goal range. The decision making is very lackluster for Russell Wilson in the last month of the regular season for the Pittsburgh Steelers. We've seen now that Russell Wilson is a boom or bust type of player recently. Unless the deep ball is working, he doesn't have a mid-range or intermediate game. If he hit you with the short passes to get the ball out of his hands quick, that's one thing, but usually the deep balls are part of him out of the pocket on a bootleg or just scrambling in the pocket and then finding somebody. They have a chance to rewrite the narratives in the postseason. This is a team that they are very familiar with, but this Ravens team, since the bye week, has been a perfect 4-0 to close out the season. I think that bye week was the perfect reset. They had a chance to recalibrate, reset, catch their breath, and since then the Ravens have been playing virtually perfect football. Again, the competition hasn't been the greatest, but still, you have to play who's on your schedule, and I think the Ravens took care of business to close out the season. Lamar has looked like an MVP candidate, and they should have a heavy dose of him running the ball and Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry, I think, is the X factor in this game. If he's able to bludgeon the Steelers defense, which has been lackluster to say the least as of late, I think the Ravens have a chance to really blow out the Steelers in this wildcard matchup. I don't think, while the Ravens defense hasn't been the greatest, they looked really good in their second matchup. Marlon Humphrey baiting Russell Wilson into a pick 6, and this Ravens defense is finally finding their way after a poor start to this year. They're not perfect, but they do get the job done and they get stops when they need to. The one thing I'm a little bit nervous about for the Baltimore Ravens is the potential absence of Zay Flowers. Now, Zay picked up a terrible knee sprain in the season finale against the Browns, and he is unlikely to suit up for this wildcard matchup next Saturday. It could be something that lingers where he could miss more time in the postseason, and that's unfortunate. He is the number 1 receiver for this Ravens team. He is a do-it-all kind of guy. If you get the ball in his hands, he's going to make plays, where it's a deep ball, a short pass, whatever have you. Zay Flowers is a integral cog in the Ravens offensive machine. But at least for this week, I do think without him, they still have enough to get by the Steelers, not just barely, but comfortably. And if the Steelers end up losing this game, this not only extends their playoff drought to 9 years. If you think about the last 6 postseason games they played, they have lost all of them. Like I said, this playoff drought is getting to be very concerning. I've been on this platform throughout this entire year when I noticed that the Steelers have been settling for just above average. Mike Tomlin has gotten you to the Super Bowl way back in 2008, and that is wonderful. He's bursted onto the scene. He was at the time the youngest head coach to win a Super Bowl. However, since then, it has been a bunch of 8-8, 9-7 records, and now it's been bolstered up to 9-8 and 10-7. That is great. Postseason appearances are great. But remember when Marvin Lewis was leading the Cincinnati Bengals, for example? He had a terrible record of leading great Bengals teams but then floundering in the playoffs. Now, Marvin Lewis is not the same kind of coach, and the Steelers aren't the same type of team as those old Bengals were, but they're beginning to look like it because in the recent years they've had issues, especially in, you can say that it's been post Ben Roethlisberger. Even with Ben Roethlisberger at the tail end of his career, they struggled when he was in the lineup. I think we need to have a conversation about Mike Tomlin's future with the Pittsburgh Steelers, because this is a class act organization and they won't fire him due to these causes, but a playoff appearance is still a playoff appearance. But the conversations need to be had that the hot seat for Mike Tomlin might need to be a little bit hotter. If they do flame out this year in the wild card round, I think they need to have a conversation that next year is put up or shut up, or you are going to be shown the door. On Sunday night, we got to see this historic matchup between two 14-2 teams. The winner gets the number 1 seed in the NFC, and they have home field advantage throughout the entire NFC playoffs. The loser has to have a tough road. They would likely have to go 3 times on the road just to get back to the Super Bowl, and likely going back to Detroit at some point. Now, if you are on this channel, I just published a piece last week about how we should re-rank the NFC playoff seedings by best record. And if you want to check that out, I'll link it for you in the description. But getting back to what the Lions and Vikings did on Sunday night, the Lions sent out a warning signal to the rest of the NFC, and even whoever could join them if they do make it to the Super Bowl. The Lions defense has been much maligned throughout this entire year. We talked about the injuries, starting off with Hutchinson, and then in the secondary, the linebacking core, whatever have you, they have been decimated. 12 starters at some point have been on IR. 12 players have been on IR at some point in this year. Now, some folks have come back, like Alex Anzalone, for example. He had a arm surgery and took a ton of stitches and is playing with a cast, but is suiting up yet again. Toughness, we appreciate that. That is grit and grind, something that Detroit and Dan Campbell have built a culture around since joining the Detroit Lions in 2021. Detroit at home, especially when they have physicality bringing it to your opponent, that is something that we haven't seen with Detroit in quite some time, especially on the defensive side. Without Hutch, I am very impressed with how Zadarius Smith has been doing. It's not gaudy stats, but in this particular matchup against Sam Darnold and this hot Vikings offense, they shut the door on any type of threats Vikings offense had. In 4 red zone trips, they were 0 for 4, including 2 stops from the Detroit 3-yard line. With weapons like Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, and TJ Hawkinson, for example, and Dalvin Cook coming out of the backfield, that is a loaded offense. And to think about all those guys as passing options and to hold them out to a virtual shutout, you didn't even allow a single touchdown throughout this entire game, as the final score was 31-9. That is very impressive for Aaron Glenn's defensive staff. He's done a splendid job since Aiden Hutchinson has left the lineup. Now, they're not a great unit from top to bottom, but that again, it comes back to injuries. They have been decimated on the defensive side. Talking about the offense, I mean, Detroit is going to do all their tricks in their bag. They have Ben Johnson, and we didn't see a ton of what the tricks that they're fully capable of doing, but they grinded out this game with a spectacular game from Jahmyr Gibbs. We're definitely seeing that Jahmyr Gibbs is taking the lead back by charge, because when David Montgomery was there, he was the guy that gets all the tough yardage, and then you probably have the home run hitter in Jahmyr Gibbs. And without Knuckles and this Sonic and Knuckles duo, Sonic is doing a hell of a job by himself, and there's a chance that Knuckles, as in David Montgomery, could be back for the postseason. The Lions have now earned a bye week, and they get a chance to rest, get those beat up bodies a time to breathe after a very tumultuous year. I mean, this took 15 wins, a franchise record, to get this 1 seed, the first time in franchise history. But as credit to Dan Campbell and this Detroit Lions staff, that they are here and they are here to stay in the NFC. Now, I think in 2 matchup against a very good Detroit Lions team, the second matchup was very telling. The first time this happened, Detroit was behind and the Vikings gave up a lead. This time, Detroit was nip and tuck in the first half, and then they hit another gear that the Vikings just could not contend with. I am concerned with Sam Darnold because that was probably the biggest game he's ever played in his career, and he didn't do so great. Now he has to go on the road at least 3 times, likely having to go back to Detroit maybe in 2 weeks' time, just to prove that he belongs in this league. Because remember, this contract talks, him staying in Minnesota, is all going to be looming over his head. And if he has another stinker in LA, which we'll talk about later in our playoff preview series, it's going to be something where we're going to be thinking about how he maybe just caught lightning in a bottle and then he got exposed when the light shined the brightest. Because Detroit did a great job of executing defensively. Their D-line got after Sam Darnold, and yes, pressure and getting hit will make any quarterback look mortal, but the fact that it sped up his clock so often, he missed easy throws to Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison where he had first downs, and the Vikings just did not look together. They looked rushed, they looked unprepared, and honestly a little soft. But they can right the wrongs in the next week against the LA Rams, which I think they're capable of doing. I think they're better than the Rams, but we'll get into a full preview a little bit later. The Los Angeles Chargers ended up getting a present on the last day of the season, with the Pittsburgh Steelers losing their last game to the Cincinnati Bengals. And with that, the Chargers were able to swoop in and grab the 5 seed. And the prize is the slumping Houston Texans. And the Texans have been a team that's been mostly regressing after their historic rookie year with a new regime. DeMeco Ryans comes in. You have the offensive rookie of the year in C.J. Stroud, the defensive rookie of the year in Will Anderson Jr. And it's a very talented roster. They make a bunch of moves with Danielle Hunter, Stephon Diggs, but Stephon Diggs hasn't played since the middle part of this year. They're down Tank Dell, and their offense is honestly a patchwork offensive line that now forces CJ Stroud to make rush decisions and just hasn't looked good on tape this year. The defense, I think, is going to be their strong suit and really is their saving grace. Even give them a chance. I do think that the Chargers, especially led by Jim Harbaugh, are better. Justin Herbert hasn't been asked to throw the ball a ton, but when he's done so, he's been great. He's actually the league leader in fewest interceptions thrown throughout the entire season. He's been great with keeping the turnovers to a minimum. I think that with them building in the trenches, I think this is a great chance for them to showcase this run game that they've been working on with J.K. Dobbins. And Joe Alt, I mean, he doesn't get enough shine as he's an offensive tackle. If there was a non-skills position player that was up there for Rookie of the Year, I mean, Joe Alt would be at the top of my list. And with the bookends tackles now really shoring up the offensive line, this has a chance to neutralize the two big threats in Will Anderson Jr. and Danielle Hunter as the edge rushers. If those two guys are neutralized, I think that gives Justin Herbert the time to sit back, scan his options, and find Ladd McConkey or Quentin Johnston, for example, on the routes that's schemed by Jim Harbaugh. And the Chargers should be able to coast an easy victory, I think, against a team in the Texans that should be a first-round exit. I think they're the worst team in this playoff bunch. The Denver Broncos are back in the playoffs after nearly a decade-long absence. The last time they were in the playoffs was in Super Bowl 50, led by Von Miller, who is now playing for the Buffalo Bills. The former Super Bowl MVP hasn't been the all-time great status that he's had in years past, but he's still been quite effective. He actually got a recent bonus in Week 18 that helped him make some extra bank. But in terms of the Bills as a whole, Bills team is definitely primed for a deep run. The emphasis to run the ball behind James Cook, I think, has been excellent to help take some pressure off of Josh Allen and limit the Josh Allen mistakes when he's trying to force balls where they don't need to be. With Josh settling in, I think he is an MVP contender. I just don't know if he's going to win it this year. This is probably his best case to do so with what he's been able to work with. And leading this Bills team to the 2 seed, I think, was a great for Josh Allen and Sean McDermott, where They're facing a team in the Denver Broncos that's been Buffalo Bills in years past. In their real first run at the playoffs, I remember they were kind of a wide-eyed team, really learning what the playoffs were all about, and then somewhat of an AFC juggernaut. They were always in the AFC playoff mix, even making an AFC championship appearance 4 or 5 years ago. But this is the time to kick off a postseason run. While the Broncos, they're happy to be here. I think Sean Payton and Bo Nix have been great in this first year working together. I think Bo Nix should, for a good part of this year, he could have been Rookie of the Year. It's just Jaden Daniels has had a historic rookie year. Should win the Rookie of the Year. With the Broncos, I think that they will make things tough. They have a great defense that's led by Pat Surtain and a vicious pass rush. They lead the league in sacks. I do think that with the playoff experience, just like we're going to see with some of these rookie quarterbacks getting into the playoffs, that it's a whole different animal. And Sean McDermott should find a way to scheme something to get some pressure on Bo Nix and make him look somewhat mortal, what he's looked like in the past. But I do think the Bills should be able to coast to a wild card victory against the 7-seeded Denver Broncos. Flipping it now to the NFC, the Packers and Eagles met in Sao Paulo for their Week 1 matchup, as this was the first game that was in the Southern Hemisphere in Brazil. Entering Sunday, the Packers lost to very talented teams. I mean, they lost to teams that have a combined record 42-9, and those are the Minnesota Vikings, the Detroit Lions, and the Philadelphia Eagles until Week 18, where they lost to the Chicago Bears. Green Bay comes in this game banged up. Jordan Love is banged up with a hand injury. He should play, but he's definitely going to be not 100%. And he's battled various under injuries like a groin strain and an MCL strain earlier on in the season. And then you also have deep threat Christian Watson, who's going to be out for the season with the torn ACL. He just tore that last week. Wish him a speedy recovery. And then standout cornerback Jair Alexander, who maybe hasn't been the best in recent years, but still is a very talented cornerback that can bait quarterbacks into bad passes. Jair Alexander will be not suiting up for this game as he's on injured reserve for the Green Bay Packers. On the other side, the Eagles are healthy. They essentially gave themselves a bye week against the New York Giants, and they rested their starters in preparations for the playoffs. I think that this rest is going to pay big dividends for them. Not having the first round bye definitely is a tricky thing to navigate, and you want to make sure that your guys are fresh. And this team has been banged up themselves, but not as serious maybe as the Green Bay Packers. Looking at these two teams, I think that the Eagles just seem to have so many more options on offense. If you think about Saquon Barkley, it starts off there in the trenches. They have the best rushing attack. With the passing options, you get back Dallas Goedert, a tight end who's been in and out of the lineup this year. You have Devontae Smith and AJ Brown, who have been getting back into the mix of things after having a mid-season lull and surrounded by some drama in early December, but back on the right track, like I've been saying. And the defense is the number one defense in the entire NFL. That is in total defense. Vic Fangio has done a spectacular job of turning around this Eagles defense that was in the bottom third of the NFL in 2023 and was a big reason for the collapse of last season. This season, they have been so disciplined on tackling. They get after it with turnovers. They're very physical, especially in the secondary, that I think that their secondary alone is going to be able to do things to the kind of now maligned Packers receiving core, where you have Quinion Mitchell, Darius Slay, Cooper DeSheen in the cornerback positions. You have Reed Blankenship and CJ Gardner-Johnson in the back end as the safeties. I think that's a very dynamic duo there and a talented secondary. Zach Bond is playing sideline to sideline, and with his linebacking teammate Nakobe Dean, I think that is a very talented linebacking duo there. And then their defensive line may be not as great as in years past, but they are littered with talent as well, and Jalen Carter just made the Pro Bowl this year, and I do think that they have some advantages in the trenches on the offensive side too. And last year we saw some magic come from Jordan Love. He caught fire at the end of the season. He led the Packers to become the first ever 7 seed to win a playoff game against the Cowboys last year. I don't think that magic is replicated this year. I just think that the Eagles have too much talent across the board that the options are just going to be so limited for the Packers, where they'll end up having to force things when they don't need to, and I think the Eagles will win this game to the divisional round. I made a video earlier this season about the collapse of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and if you guys want to go check it out, I'll link it for you guys in the description. But basically, we are at a point with the Jaguars where they decided to keep Trent Baalke but fire Doug Peterson. And Doug Peterson, I understand he's been not so great the last couple of years. After the Jaguars started off 8-3, they were on the brink of having the 1 seed, but after Trevor Lawrence sprained his ankle, the season went off the tracks. Since then, the Jaguars did not get off to the best start in 2024. It was just a season that never seemed to get going. Trevor Lawrence was in and out of the lineup with a shoulder injury and then later sustained a serious concussion due to a late hit against the Houston Texans, and we didn't see him suit up for the Jags for the rest of the season. And we knew at that point anyways Doug Peterson was on the way out. It was just a matter of determining, is Trent Baalke going to be out with him? I've been consistent on this channel that I'm not a big fan of Trent Baalke. I mean, when he was in San Francisco, he somehow won a power struggle with Jim Harbaugh, who guided the San Francisco 49ers to their first Super Bowl appearance in nearly 2 decades. And then in his next stop, he was able to overcome a power struggle with him and Doug Peterson, who actually won a Super Bowl in his previous stop in Philly. Looking at Trent Baalke's moves since becoming the Jaguars GM, I mean, the first one was pretty obvious. In 2021, he had the first overall pick, and that was a slam dunk. You picked Trevor Lawrence, easy peasy. But since then, there's been a lot of suspect moves, and to highlight on some of them, I mean, you talk about the 2022 offseason when he doled out a ton of cash to Christian Kirk, who was a decent receiver over in his days in Arizona, but not a true hot commodity. And that was the season when we saw a ton of wide receiver movement, including Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, and so many other receivers were moving around the league, but instead he doles out a ton of money to Christian Kirk. Kirk had a decent year in 2022, but since then has definitely tailed off. Fast forward to April's draft in 2022, Trent Baalke had the number 1 overall selection yet again, but instead of picking standout pass rusher from Michigan, Aiden Hutchinson, he decided to go with Travon Walker from the University of Georgia. And obviously Georgia had a historic defense that led them to the national championship earlier in that college football season. But Travon Walker was not the hottest commodity coming out of college. He was a project type of player, very raw, and has since had a decent career, but compared to Aiden Hutchinson, who has played in 9 fewer games at the point of this recording, Travon Walker actually has fewer sacks than Aiden Hutchinson, and that was a massive miss. In fact, that was criminal that he missed on such a move like that. Fast forward to 2023, instead of to try to bolster the offensive line, he goes with Anton Harrison, and he has simply just not panned out. A lot of moves, just hasn't been the greatest for the Jaguars since Trent Baalke has become the GM. I will credit Trent for picking up Brian Thomas Jr. in this year's draft, as Brian Thomas Jr. has been one of the best wide receivers in the league coming in as a rookie. And I mean, I think the Jaguars absolutely hit a home run with that draft pick, and Brian Thomas has been successful with multiple quarterbacks throwing him the ball this season. But other than that, I don't see too many great moves with Trent Baalke. And to think back to his days in San Francisco, wasn't great in San Francisco either. With this move that Shad Khan made, retaining Trent Baalke, this is raising a lot of eyebrows and scratching a lot of heads. That are the Jaguars really serious about winning? Because keeping Trent Baalke means that the head coach that they do inevitably hire is going to have to answer to Trent Baalke. And if the leash is short and this is truly Trent Baalke's last year, then you're really missing out on an opportunity to pick a head coach GM duo, and then we're going to be in this vicious cycle that we've been seeing with a team like the Chicago Bears, who fire a GM, rehire one, fire the head coach, then get a new quarterback, etc., etc. They do have Trevor Lawrence and some pretty attractive pieces on offense, and I think eventually they will find some type of offensive-minded guy, but they're going to be in a big rebuild, because with the massive contract that Trevor Lawrence has, there's not a ton of cap room to build around that type of contract, and there's going to be moving parts. So inevitably, I do definitely think that Sean Khan missed an opportunity and he will absolutely regret retaining Trent Baalke as GM. The New York Giants, in a surprising move, actually retained GM Joe Schoen and head coach Brian Daboll. In a nightmare season, finishing with only 3 wins, where they let their prized running back Saquon Barkley walk for nothing and he's flourishing in Philadelphia en route to a 2,000-yard season, they didn't have the best offseason. Now, in terms of trying to stop the bleeding, I mean, I'll give Joe Schoen some credit. Bringing in Brian Burns and drafting Malik Neighbors were great moves, but outside of those 2 players and Dexter Lawrence, they should definitely be fielding phone calls or looking to get out of contracts for those players that I did not name. The Giants are a mess, and with this nightmare season, they have a lot of questions that remain to be answered. With this being basically their last-ditch opportunity to save their jobs, they're going to have to, one, probably find a signal caller to take over the offense as they let go of Daniel Jones mid-season. Great move right there, giving him the bag and not Saquon, and only to cut him 18 months after signing him to that massive deal. But talking about the management of the New York Giants, when the Giants had an opportunity to essentially tank the season, they won a meaningless game with Drew Lock leading the way, and that win is going to cost them for years to come. They had an opportunity to have the first overall draft pick, but the win against the Indianapolis Colts meant that their positioning would drop to the worst in the 4th spot. Now, their loss to Philadelphia in Week 18 did help their odds to get to the 3rd overall position, but the way it's looking like with the QBs coming in, it's expected that either Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward would go number 2, and then the 3rd overall pick would be somebody else. Travis Hunter is one hell of a consolation prize, don't get me wrong. He's a very talented 2-way type of player. I expect him to be cornerback when he comes into the NFL, but the Giants need a quarterback, and if they don't have a quarterback coming into this final year, then what's the point of just ripping off the Band-Aid and starting anew? But John Mara decides that he's going to give these 2 one last chance to right the ship, and it's going to be all hands on deck for New York, especially with Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen as the GM, to make some moves, because right now with the Giants, they look utterly lost and they have a long way to get out of this rebuild to get back to being competitive in the NFC. Deja vu for the Minnesota Vikings. They lose to the Detroit Lions and then they have to travel out west to play the LA Rams. In this winning, and just like before, they had a winning streak snapped by the Lions and now basically have to lick their wounds, and this is a do or die situation. The Rams can be had. I think that Matthew Stafford has been great, but there's definitely times that he can be a little bit gun shy and then be hit by a kind of suspect offensive line. The Vikings defense is definitely going to try and redeem themselves after a poor showing against the Detroit Lions, where they were gouged by Jahmyr Gibbs and Jared Goff at times, but mostly Jahmyr Gibbs. And they should be able to get around the O-line that can be up and down for the LA Rams. But on the flip side, the Rams can also do the same thing, where they also have a tough defensive line. And we've seen that when Sam Darnold is hit, he becomes mortal. And in the process, I do think that Kyren Williams, if he's able to replicate anything that Jahmyr Gibbs had, this could get very ugly. The Rams secondary can be a little bit suspect, so that's advantage Vikings with a talented receiving core plus the tight end in TJ Hawkinson. But based off what I can conclude, I think the Vikings just have a little bit more than the Rams. They'll be tough yet again, but I'll give it to the Minnesota Vikings to set up a rematch against the Detroit Lions in 2 weeks. The next clip is from the previous week's episode, but it was cut due to time constraints, but I wanted to add that in, so please enjoy. I've had some time to look into this topic, where Christmas Day used to be the NBA showcase. 5 games, noon to midnight, and it was usually a spectacle. We got to see great matchups between some of the superstar players, and even some postseason preview matchups, and even some finals preview matchups. But in recent years, the NFL has infiltrated Christmas Day. Instead of yielding to the NBA, the NFL has decided to have games on Christmas Day, including this year when Christmas Day actually was on a Wednesday. And usually we see a random NFL game get thrown in on a Monday or a Thursday or Friday and then Saturday and then whatever have you. But in this case, Netflix joined in as partnership with the NFL. They have gotten the kinks fixed since the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson disaster. About 6 weeks ago, in this big fight that was hyped up from many people in the boxing world, I tuned in, and like many other viewers that watched that fight, there was numerous issues with buffering. But in the time since, Netflix has gone into the lab and they fixed any type of bugs, and I watched the telecast for both games and there was really no issues with buffering at all. I thought it was a seamless telecast with a lot of great analysts from various networks, from ESPN, Fox, NFL Network, whatever have you, and they were all there. And I thought it was a great presentation. And this could be something that the NFL continues to use, because Netflix, I believe, has a contract with the NFL for the next 2 Christmases. If you look at how the 2 games stacked up in terms of watch numbers, each game pulled in almost over 24 million viewers, and one of those individual games is nearly as much as the total NBA viewership across 5 games. That is a staggering stat. On a day where the NBA used to have 5 games, uninterrupted basketball, that was really the NBA showcase. But the NFL has gotten in. Really, it's not even close. Many people in the basketball world can talk about it's an international game. A lot of more people follow it from all over the world, and football, at least American football, is strictly a sport played in the USA. However, we've been seeing that the NFL has been expanding. They have games all over Europe. They just had a game in Brazil. We're seeing players from all over the world play this sport. And in 2028, the NFL is partnering with the Olympics, and they're going to have flag football in the LA Olympics. Basketball is facing a viewership problem, and that's really what I wanted to get into with this particular video. Why exactly is viewership diminishing or declining in today's market? Today we have so many ways to access media, whether it's through our phones, tablet. There's so many streaming providers out there in the world, but for whatever reason, the NBA is struggling with viewership and ratings. There's a multitude of reasons as to why this is happening, namely with players sitting out of games. The main culprits I've seen, and I've been consistent on this channel, is Joel Embiid, Zion Williamson, and Kawhi Leonard. And to put in Devin Booker, he's not a consistent offender of this, but an example of him is when he has this groin injury, and I do not know the severity of the groin injury. I do wish Devin a speedy recovery, but he is one of the biggest stars for the Phoenix Suns, and he did not suit up for this Christmas Day matchup against the Denver Nuggets with Nikola Jokic opposite of him. That was a late night game. Not a lot of people watched that anyways, unless you were a diehard Suns, Nuggets, or NBA fan, but I'm sure that played a part in the decreased viewership and the poorer ratings. One thing is that when these young stars do inevitably inherit the NBA from a league that has been surrounded and devoted to stars like LeBron James, Stephen Curry, and Kevin Durant, those 3 guys will eventually retire. I mean, just this past Olympic run, we think that that could be the final time we see them play all together in the Olympics. And we've been saying it, Father Time is undefeated and LeBron's time is limited. I'm sure Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, their time is definitely on the way out in the next few years. And the NBA is going to have a big time problem on who's going to take over as the face of the NBA once those 3 players retire. These younger players are entitled, they're unserious, and at times they are very selfish. We see them get coaches fired, we see them force trades out of smaller markets, and then inevitably they still find a way to get max NBA contracts where they get extension upon extension. And if you look at an NBA, a very average NBA player makes tons more money than some of even the greatest NFL players. And it's obviously apples to oranges, but if you're just looking at a monetary standpoint, it's a big difference between how the NBA money is coming in versus the NFL money. And the way it gets distributed out and kind of perceived as the consumer is definitely something that has become a note as many fans are becoming increasingly frustrated with young stars being part-time players essentially and not showing up to games. I mean, the classic example is that yet again another Christmas season has passed and there's families who can't afford to go to many games, or they maybe live far away from a particular NBA team and their kids want to see a particular NBA player. That might include flights, hotels, a drive, whatever have you. Those all cost money. And then imagine just going there and that player is either out due to injury or they're load managing. And that's completely disrespectful to the fan that put in the time, the effort, and they may not be able to get an opportunity to see that player play the rest of the season, because we know that teams of the opposite conference only come to that one city once a year. And it's really hard when that player is not available for that one particular matchup. I think the biggest offender of this is Kawhi Leonard. In 2021, during the postseason, he tore his ACL. And that's a very serious knee injury where he missed the 2022 season and then finally suited up for the 2022-2023 season. But when it came to the postseason, he played a couple games and then had more knee problems and missed the rest of the series. In the following season, he came back and actually had one of his most productive years since leading the Toronto Raptors to the 2019 NBA title. However, he suffered another injury and his knee didn't recover as well, and this was in March. He played sparingly, and then when it came to the postseason, he played a couple games and kind of disrupted the Clippers lineup and eventually was shelved for the rest of the season as the Clippers were yet again eliminated in the first round. Somehow, Kawhi always gets activated to play enough games to get that extension, and then right on schedule, some knee injury is there to disrupt the play, and then the Clippers are on the hook for Kawhi's rehab, recovery, and then he's sitting around on the sideline. I mean, he has yet to even suit up in this season alone. He's rumored to be coming back at the beginning of January, but he hasn't stepped foot on the court since mid-April of 2024. Now, another player I think is a big offender. This is Zion Williamson. He had a chance in 2019 after jumping into the scene with a fantastic freshman year with Duke and could have been this next generational talent. However, with poor diet and injuries have led him to be a part-time player as well. It's just that simple. In the same draft, you saw Jackson Hayes get drafted, and while he's been with the Los Angeles Lakers for the last couple of years, Jackson Hayes has actually played more games with the New Orleans Pelicans than Zion Williamson had. And another guy, Ja Morant, who has had numerous run-ins with legal problems and brandishing weapons on IG Live, and just not being a good example for kids who look up to guys like Ja. Ja had this ungodly leaping ability, and unfortunately with suspensions and then injuries, his play has kind of diminished since, and we haven't seen Ja be the same type of impact on the Memphis Grizzlies that we saw early on in his career. And we've seen where JJ Redick has said that players back in the day were going against plumbers and firemen, and for whatever reason, those players seem to stay in shape. Jerry West, Will Chamberlain, for example, they played 80 games, even all 82 games, very consistently. I can't name a player that's played all 82 games in the last 3-4 seasons, and it's a rarity. Guys even like LeBron, as great as he is and as a long career that he's had in this league, he's only played 82 games once in his entire career. That's just something where we've seen load management come into play. It's just been disappointing. I could point fingers at the players I just listed, Paul George or Joel Embiid, but that part-time basis is just very frustrating for fans, and that's one of their main gripes with the NBA as currently constructed. Unfortunately, I don't want to bring politics into this, but the way the players carry themselves and discuss politics has been a major gripe with fans today. I mean, if you look at how fans consume the media and how fans react to certain things, I respect players like LeBron and Steph for discussing hard topics, and I don't think that they should just shut up and dribble. The way that they do present themselves, unfortunately, is a major turnoff to certain populations especially in the US, where basketball, particularly the NBA, has been a major stronghold. And if you just look at the ratings since 2012, they have dropped by 48%. And particularly on ESPN, which is a Disney-owned company, just this year alone, ratings have dropped by 28%. And we can credit Disney for helping to save the 2020 NBA season with the Orlando bubble when the pandemic was ravaging the entire globe, but they actually haven't been well perceived, especially in the mass media in public consumption. If you think about with what Disney stands on and then therefore ESPN, they've been a lot of things that have turned off a significant population of the consumers that do like the NBA. I mean, the lack of rivalries, the lack of care. You're seeing so many players be buddy-buddy. You're seeing them dap each other up. You're seeing them hug. You're seeing them hang out, vacation together. And that is something that you've seen in the past. I've definitely seen that players back in the day, they played golf with each other. They maybe hung out together during a postseason series, whatever have you. But when it comes out onto the court, it is war. And those players from the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, they were no longer friends with their opposition. They were willing to give their opposition hard fouls, even flagrant fouls in today's NBA. And I think that's definitely something that, again, is turning off fans from turning on NBA games. Something else that I've noticed is how refs perceive calls. I mean, refs today in the NBA are so quick to eject players by technical fouls. If your player gets 2 technical fouls, they're automatically ejected. They cannot argue calls. They cannot clap their hands. They cannot have a simple conversation. They cannot display frustration at refs. Refs are so quick, so sensitive to give technical fouls. And yet again, imagine if a fan who has maybe the one opportunity to see a LeBron James or a Nikola Jokic, and then they get ejected due to a poor call made by the referee. That can be very clearly distinguished on replay. But with that being said, those are another issue that major fans have with today's NBA. The last big point is regional blackouts. And the way things are going and trending towards streaming, there are still cases where you have local regional blackouts, and that forces the fans to basically attend the games in person and buy into a franchise that is struggling to bring in fans and fill up their seats. I go to Wizards games on a consistent basis, and unless it's a very attractive road team, there are a lot of times where the seats in Capital One Arena are empty. No one really comes out to see Wizards game unless you're really interested in basketball like myself. And when you have League Pass that is supposedly going to give you access to all the NBA games, but then when you get hit with a regional blackout, that's a turnoff for fans. I mean, you devote time and then that basically pushes away and bites the hand that essentially feeds you. They are forced to consume something else with their time after work. So these are all things that the NBA is currently struggling in terms of their ratings and viewership. If that's the case, I think this does spell some trouble for the NBA. So that's it for this episode of Spectator Sports. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Remember, to help this channel grow, reach a broader audience, we're going to need your help. Drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you want to get clips from today's episode, we got that for you here on YouTube as well on TikTok. And you want to get the audio, we got that for you on Spotify. Links in the description. Shout out to Joy for editing this podcast. And I'll catch you all on the next one. Take care, everybody.